Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday, the 22nd of September. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined today by Philippa Whitford, former SNP MP for Central Ayrshire, and Hugh Marshall, founder of Talking Wales. Good afternoon to you both.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. And just apologies to the viewers at home and to our guests, because the only reason for the late start of the show today is my tardiness. Public transport let me down, so apologies for that. We'll start with today's Ukraine update, and today is day 942 of the war in Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky has urged President Biden to allow Ukraine to carry out long-range strikes inside Russia with US-supplied weapons and to earn a place in history by strengthening Ukraine before he leaves office. Speaking before a crucial trip to the US, including the UN, to shore up support for Ukraine in the war, Zelensky said he would present a victory plan to end the war. On Sunday, Zelensky will visit the Pennsylvania ammunition factory that is producing one of the most critically needed munitions for his country's fight. He's expected to go to the Scranton Army ammunition plant to kick off a busy week in the US, shoring up support for Ukraine, officials told the Associated Press. This week he also will address the UN General Assembly's annual gathering in New York and travel to Washington for talks with President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. President Zelensky also said on Saturday that the end of the war depended on the resolve of Kyiv's Western allies in providing needed weaponry and permission to use it. Speaking in his nightly video address, he issued further pleas to boost supplies of weaponry to fend off the slow advance of Russian forces in the Donetsk region. Ukraine's foreign minister said on Saturday that Russia is planning strikes on Ukrainian nuclear facilities before the winter and urged the UN's nuclear watchdog and allies to establish permanent monitoring missions at the country's nuclear plants. There was no immediate comment from Moscow. Russia will take no part in any follow-up to the Swiss-organised peace summit held in June, as the process amounts to fraud, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova said on Saturday. In the western Tver region of Russia, authorities announced on Saturday the temporal closure of a major federal road after the Ukrainian attack near the city of Toropets, about 380 kilometres northwest of Moscow and 500 kilometres from the Ukrainian border. Ukrainian officials said on Saturday their forces had hit two Russian munitions depots overnight in attacks that illustrated its growing capability to strike targets deep inside Russia. A statement by Ukraine's military general staff said at least 2,000 tons of weaponry, including missiles supplied by North Korea, were destroyed at Tikhoretsk in southern Russia and Okholabskry in the western region of Tver. Apologies for my pronunciations there. Russian forces struck a multi-storey apartment building in Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, on Saturday evening, injuring at least 12 people and prompting an evacuation of some of its residents, Mayor Ihor Terekov said. Terekov said the Russians had deployed a guided bomb. A 12-year-old boy and two older women were killed as Russian missiles struck Kryvyi Rih, Zelensky's hometown in central Ukraine, local governor Serhiy Lysak said on Saturday. And Iran unveiled a new ballistic missile in an upgraded one-way attack drone at a military parade on Saturday, state media said, amid soaring regional tensions and allegations of arming Russia. Philippa, I don't know what you're going to be able to say after so many 924 days of the war in Ukraine, but that was quite a fulsome 942 days, forgive me. It's quite a fulsome report, and yet very little of that do we hear elsewhere on the mainstream media.
I think, Brian, that just demonstrates what happens with all global crises. And, we're going to discuss Gaza, and we're seeing the same thing, which is that gradually it slides down the news agenda. So unless there's something brand new or atrocious or on a different scale, you find it relegated to, the middle pages or a small note or at the end of any kind of news bulletin. And the problem is that with so much instability and conflict in the world. You know, Ukraine might get a mention, Gaza gets a mention, Sudan doesn't get mentioned at all. So, we see this all the time, that big crises just slide down the agenda. And therefore, that means if they slide down the media agenda, sadly, they also go down the political agenda. And that is a real problem when you're trying to move forward. And of course, the conflict in Ukraine and Russia's aggression threatens the whole of Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. So, it's a threat that really should be coming home to all politicians. But we just see it get into this chronic mode, and then it just doesn't get the coverage anymore.
Thank you, Philippa. Hugh, is there anything that you'd maybe like to mention or highlight?
I think it's interesting because, again, it's how we define the media. It was quite interesting. I watched Carol Vorderman's alternative McTaggart speech from this year's Edinburgh TV Festival, and she was making it quite clear. 50% of 16 to 24-year-olds watch traditional broadcast, sort of TV. So, accessing sort of, traditional media is becoming, sort of less and less prominent. But obviously people are accessing stuff on social media. My social media feeds are full of Gaza with a little bit of Ukraine. And I think, as Philippa was saying, I think we, after a while, we become numb to it. We become immune. How many pictures have we seen? I remember at the beginning of, bloodied Ukrainian bodies. Now it's, it's sort of big children, babies in Palestine. And it is a huge issue, as you say, from a political point of view. Political timing is everything. We've got a presidential election coming up. So rather than, people, we should all be horrified that Ukraine, a Western country, not dissimilar to Wales and Scotland, is under attack from a foreign force. And yet we allow it to sort of happen as if, oh, well, it'll sort itself out in the end. It's worrying, but it's also deeply depressing.
Thank you, Hugh. So moving on, forgive me, moving on to the update in Gaza and Israel. At least 41,391 Palestinians have been killed and 95,760 injured in Gaza since the 7th of October. If any other country had executed a plan to distribute booby-trapped devices among the population of another country, there would have been an outcry about an act of terrorism. But Israel seems to be able to act with impunity. If any other country militarily stormed and vandalised a country's organisations or offices, there would be an outcry. But Israel acts with impunity. When does the world say enough is enough and mean it? Hugh, is there anything that you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, well, I think the situation is deeply disturbing, and I think again we refer back to Ukraine. The fact that there's a presidential campaign ongoing. Netanyahu has announced this morning that he doesn't want things to become a full-scale war, as if he doesn't realise that he's in the middle of one already. And I think it's clear that Netanyahu is, he's just trying to save his skin. And it's incredibly sad that we're allowing a situation that has seen tens of thousands of innocent people die, and amongst them, a disproportionate amount of women and children, just so that one individual can try and keep hold of his political position. Remove Netanyahu, and you're in a position to be able to try and sort things. I was reading this week that despite the devastation and destruction that has become of Gaza, sort of huge swathes of Gaza now are just rubble. Apparently, Hamas hasn't really been impacted as much as a fighting force. So this isn't going to end when they've finally sort of got rid of Hamas, because apparently it appears that Hamas is still relatively, strong from a numbers perspective. So, where do we go from here? Are we going to have to wait until November the 6th when there's the election results start coming through from the United States? United Nations. I remember as a young person growing up in the 70s and 80s, the United Nations was a body that had integrity and powers. It's now meaningless. The fact that Russia, still have a seat at the table while they're waging a war, it's just farcical. I honestly don't know what the answer is.
Thank you, Hugh. Philippa, do you maybe know what the answer is?
Oh, I can't claim to know what the answer is, but I think having lived and worked in Gaza, as you know, I know what the question is, and certainly there is no possibility of Israel bombing its way to peace and security. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, I'm from Belfast originally. Imagine if after the bombs the IRA planted in mainland GB, they had decided to bomb Northern Ireland to get rid of the IRA. I mean, that's the kind of equivalence where you're saying there are terrorists in this area. We're just going to bomb everybody to get rid of them. And 2/3 to 70% of those who've been killed, the 41, nearly 42,000 registered dead in Gaza, are women and children. And it's suspected that 10 to 15,000 more are still under rubble, with their bodies not being recovered. Now, these just become numbers, and particularly in the media, it's just listed as a growing number. But for me, with friends and colleagues in Gaza, it has a human face. And I think I've mentioned it before when I've been on. One of my good friends from when we lived there in the early 90s lost 48 members of his family in one night when his house was bombed, including 3 children and 3 grandchildren, the youngest of whom was 5 months old. And that's the danger, that they just become numbers. And what we're hearing in briefings from medical teams returning that I'm attending is the absolute horror of what's going on and the sheer scale of people suffering from infectious diseases, other diseases that can't be treated because the healthcare system in Gaza is largely destroyed and they can't access medical supplies. Now, all of this is against international law, as indeed is booby trapping common implements such as the pagers and walkie talkies. We hear that staff in the American hospital in Beirut had to be told to dispose of their own pagers. So you are creating terror among ordinary civilian population of Lebanon by this move. And it is completely against international law. The UN made a statement in Geneva on the 19th of September, absolutely decrying this. And yet, as you said, Israel seems to always act with impunity. And that's because time after time, invasion of Gaza after invasion of Gaza, the building of settlements which are against international law, kind of extreme settlers backed by IDF attacking Palestinian communities in the West Bank. It goes on and on. And yet, the government here in the UK, in America, Germany, countries like that, keep trying to excuse Israel. And in defending the indefensible, they are destroying international humanitarian law itself. So, how are they going to criticize whether it's a terrorist group or whether it's China invading Taiwan or trying to destabilize the West, if suddenly the gadgets that we bought from China were booby trapped and started to explode? I mean, you're literally removing any moral authority when you keep defending the actions of the Israeli government, and particularly Netanyahu, who absolutely, as Hugh says, is only interested in saving his own political skin and staying out of the courts. And of course, we've heard today that the Israeli government are shutting down the Al Jazeera office in Ramallah because, of course, you can't be allowing news to get out. You have to silence news. And that's exactly what we're seeing going on. And anyone who tries to speak up and criticize Israel is quickly silenced.
Thank you, Philippa. With your expertise and having lived and worked in Gaza and having been an MP, what do you think of what's coming out of the Starmer government to do with Israel and Gaza at the moment?
Well, obviously, before the election and over the bulk of this 11-month war so far, coming up for the anniversary in 2 weeks' time, it's been utterly disgraceful. From his very first statement on LBC when he appeared to back the blockage of fuel and water. I mean, that's absolutely against international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions. The mealy mouthed language that he used, the failure to back the SNP amendment to the King's Speech in November last year, and then, of course, that absolute nonsense that we saw happen in February when they got the Speaker to block the SNP opposition motion. So we had all sorts of contortions. And of course, we'll see what happens, the Labour conference starting. And the rumour is that any attempt to have a genuine debate on motions about Labour policy in towards Gaza, but also towards Israel, the Middle East in general, being either completely stifled or watered down. And the problem is we are in real danger of the entire Middle East being dragged into a war. And exactly as you said, Netanyahu may say, "I don't want a war," but their actions in Lebanon this week literally increase the risk of that happening. And, we've already had wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. So having the entire region destabilized by Israel's actions is something that the West should be frightened of. And even if they are friends of Israel, they should be critical friends, because this will not increase the security for Israeli civilians. It's quite the opposite. It puts them in danger of a spiraling into the abyss of violence and retribution going forward.
Thank you, Philippa. Hugh, I'm just thinking about Starmer and Labour and their position on Gaza seems to contrast with the SNP figures like Hamza Yousaf's consistent position on Gaza from the very start. How does that come across in the media, and does it get any traction or gain?
Yeah, because it's interesting. I think we referenced this in previous appearances. The Labour government in the Senedd in Cardiff has, taken a different approach and has been, outspoken and alongside Plaid Cymru and the Lib Dems calling for a ceasefire. So again, it shows you that Labour in London, Labour in Scotland, Labour in Wales, they behave in different ways depending on what the public opinion is on the ground. It would appear. So it's just a very confused state of affairs, and I think that one of the weaknesses of just the media in general is sort of showing these discrepancies, because there are discrepancies between Labour in London and Labour in Scotland, although they're much more closely aligned as they are in Wales, and obviously we've got a new First Minister now, Eluned Morgan, who made an embarrassing appearance on television this week when she was asked, about sort of influencing policy and making things better in Wales. When the presenter told her, "You've got a direct line now to Keir Starmer," and her response was, "Well, I could call Donald Trump," and it was just the fact that they just don't seem to be joined up. You have a Labour Party in London who are in overall control of everything supposedly, and I'm sure we'll go on to discuss that in a bit. But again, Labour just there's a lack of coherence there, especially from a devolved perspective.
Um, what about what about Al Jazeera? Is that somebody that you follow, or have you any thoughts on?
Yeah, no, it's terrifying, isn't it? When you think about it, as Philippa said, they just want to shut down any commentary or reporting. The fact that they don't, allow foreign journalists into Gaza to report, speaks volumes. So yeah, but it's not surprising, because again, they're just trying to vilify, anything that isn't part of the Israeli sort of state and machine. They're going to try and shut it down, and allow any sort of real reporting or discussion to take place. And going back to the point about how the media covers these issues, Adrian Child's program on Radio 5 on Friday afternoon, they had Gito Harry on, who many of you will remember as Boris Johnson's sort of one of his staff and advisors, uh, uh, and cheerleaders. And he was on Adrian Child's program, and they were talking about the pages and walkie-talkie explosions in Lebanon. And Gita Hari was saying, "Oh, it's fantastic. It's like 007," but Childs didn't pull him up and say, "Well, actually, no, this is an act of terrorism." So again, there are responsibilities on the media to report things as they are. The fact that they're scared of using the word genocide, when clearly that is what is happening in Palestine.
Thank you, Hugh. So we'll move on to the next item, which is the Labour Party. So it seems that Keir Starmer's honeymoon is over, which is unfortunate timing, because Labour's about to go to conference in Liverpool tomorrow. There were negative headlines over freebies of more than £100,000 worth. I've heard comments, people saying that Keir Starmer should have gone to Specsavers, and there have been hints of unrest in Number 10. And one Labour MP said what should have been a victory parade and the height of the administration's power has already stalled. Meanwhile, the SNP challenged Starmer to reverse cuts to pensioners and low-income households ahead of Labour's conference in Liverpool. The irony is that Liverpool is seen as a microcosm of the damage that the Labour government have been inflicting across the UK. And the poll by Survation, Labour are falling in the polls, poll by Survation on Wednesday found that a majority of Scots, 56%, do not think Labour government is acting in the best interests of Scotland. And the poll also found that a majority of 51% of Scots opposed Labour's cuts to winter fuel payments. Kirsty Blackman of the SNP raised the issue of transparency, said questions remain, asked if Rachel Reeves and Angela Rayner would try to cover up donations by claiming them as work for duties, so the public wouldn't know. That's if you're an arts minister and you go to a glittering arts event, then it's considered work and it's not considered a freebie. But voters were promised change, but instead the Labour Party is copying the worst excesses of the Tory sleaze austerity cuts and cronyism. It's no wonder they're plummeting in the polls, Blackman said. Philippa, have you been in touch with your colleagues in Westminster, or what do you think of the scenario that's unfolding?
Well, obviously, we're all still in various chat groups and whatnot to keep up with each other. But I mean, to be honest, you're seeing all of this splashed across the media. I think Labour were already falling in the polls because of their decisions rather than these scandals. These scandals just come on top of that. The cronyism, the Sue Gray salary, the suits and glasses for Starmer and his wife, the freebies, the whole rest of it. But actually, the more important thing, and that's what we need to be careful of, is not letting the dead cat of these scandals actually overshadow the much scarier policy decisions of keeping the two-child benefit limit and also the now cut to the winter fuel payment for pensioners, which is, of course, going to hit pensioners in Scotland much harder because we're the coldest part of the UK. I mean, when I was staying in London, in my small flat, I had my heating on for 3 or 4 months of the year. The rest of the time, you could get by without it. In Scotland, you're lucky if you have your heating off for 3 months of the year. So, there's no wonder that people spend much more of their income on fuel and energy. But we also have the bizarre situation of people in the north of Scotland, paying much higher standing charges in a place that produces green electricity than people pay in London that doesn't produce anything. And our generators actually pay 10 to 15 times the transmission charges of a power station in the middle of England. So both our generators and our consumers are penalised when Scotland is awash with energy resources. And, coming into this winter with an expected £150 increase in energy costs, losing the £200 to £300 winter fuel payment support, this is going to be really painful. And it's been limited now only to those who are on pension credit. Well, the threshold for that is below 11,500. So someone on £12,000 a year wouldn't qualify for any kind of support. I mean, you can hardly call them wealthy pensioners. So this is going to drive a lot of pensioners into poverty, and in actual fact will result in more elderly landing in hospital, landing in social care. So as with austerity in general, in the end, it doesn't work. It doesn't save money. It costs money. It just costs money on someone else's balance sheet.
Thank you, Philippa. And we'll be coming on to the UK economy, but it strikes me that if you give people like on a lower wages cash, they spend it. They don't invest it in a hedge fund somewhere or in a work of art. But Hugh, I was listening to James O'Brien earlier in the week, and he was kind of complaining that the way Labour have been getting treated in the press or in the mainstream media over the freebies wasn't fair, because Starmer's, the sums that are mentioned are minuscule compared to the eye-watering sums that Boris Johnson was showered him with, and he'd also tried to cover those amounts up. But do you think, is O'Brien naive? I couldn't help thinking that if it's that bad, you should try being an SNP politician. And should mainstream media have waited? Should they wait until Starmer reaches the same amount of freebies and the like that Boris Johnson reached at, and then they'd be able to criticise him? Would we have to wait that long?
I agree to him to a certain extent, because these are the things that are being reported now. And remember, when we say being reported, it's the front pages of the Daily Mail, the Express, the right-wing papers, who weren't reporting this kind of thing when it was happening in far greater, sort of sums of money under the Conservatives. So there's clearly a political agenda there that they're going to want to damage that. I did find it really odd that, Chris Mason was, sort of lauding, the BBC's political editor, who followed on from Koonsberg, lauding the fact that they'd got this scoop when he himself is on almost £250,000 a year. And when you think about, the Prime Minister has been paid 170,000. Sue Gray's been paid 180,000. Well, I would wager that both of those jobs are far more demanding than being political editor of the BBC. So, we need to take into consideration, the sums. Yes, they are huge sums of money, but look at the responsibilities that come with those roles. But I think it is interesting. I think this conference is just opened half an hour ago, and that I think there's going to be a chance here for them to actually discuss policy, because that's one thing. They have been very, very light on policy. They're still talking about change and changing the Labour Party, and that's how they got elected. When the reality is it was, reform stealing votes away from the Conservatives that gave them such a huge majority. But I think one of the issues with Starmer, though, is with what's happened now with accepting money for clothes and glasses. It's incredible, that Starmer is, when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, he was probably earning far more. I think the DPP at the moment earns around £500,000 a year. So he is somebody who's made money over the years. He doesn't need people to buy him clothes and buy his wife clothes. And if people are buying things for you, then it's very naive to think you're not getting anything in return. And I think the fact that Lord Ali, who was basically, he was a TV mogul, he was the person who brought us The Big Breakfast and lots of the shows on Channel 4 originally. The fact that he had access to Downing Street and was given that pass by Sue Gray, allegedly. It does make you wonder. But what's interesting is, and this goes back to what happened in Wales with Vaughan Gething, the First Minister, who had to give up his position in the end. He received £200,000 donation towards his campaign to become First Minister from a company whose owner had been convicted of environmental crimes. But the line that came from Vaughan Gething was, "I haven't broken any rules," and says, no, he hadn't broken any rules. But anybody looks at that thinking, why are you accepting £200,000? What advantage does that give you over your opponent? And I think with Starmer is the fact that he used the same line, "I didn't break any rules." No, sort of fine. But as somebody who says that, as a former DPP, you should understand that as general public wouldn't sort of accept money for clothing without expecting something in return. And it's this lack of understanding. And he should have just said, yeah, you know what? It was wrong. I shouldn't have. And just admitted it. But again, it's this failure of politicians of all parties. But again, unsurprising to see Starmer, leader of us saying, well, I didn't break any rules and I won't be accepting any more in future. It's just it's a bad look. And it's unsurprising now that, after the election, that we're seeing his popularity fall, because I think people just, don't like the look of him, and they're not offering anything, apart from promises of future cuts and austerity, and it's not a great way to run a political party.
Thank you, Hugh. Philippa, time's kind of against us, but do you think that when Labour came in on that word saying that it's going to be change, and you've seen it, how Westminster works, you were there as an MP, could these be the kind of changes that Labour could really make a difference on, about how MPs behave?
I think they certainly could. There have been different discussions there. Rules could be tightened, whether it's on, freebies or second jobs, income from other sources, etc. There's lots of things that could be done to tighten up the behaviour of MPs, but also ministers. I mean, what we saw under the Tories was also an awful lot of cronyism. Then we saw all the COVID contracts, literally millions of pounds handed out to some pal from down the pub, which was really quite scary in a time of national crisis, while companies that actually genuinely produced PPE or made ventilators, couldn't get the government's ear. So, I agree what we've heard of is not on the scale of what was happening under the Conservatives, but it is something that should be tightened up. But I think the kind of falling out of love with the Labour Party in just a couple of months since the election is probably more driven by their decision to keep the 2-child limit and to remove the winter fuel payment. So we're talking about driving more children into poverty, driving more pensioners into poverty, and we're told the budget's going to be worse, that public services, which have been starved of funds for the last 14 years, are actually going to be told to tighten their belts further. That's not the change people wanted. So all of this, they had a very easy ride because they could just say, vote us to kick the Tories out. That was just such a simple mantra. But actually, all we've done is go back to the austerity of George Osborne. So all the change is going back, a couple of versions of Tory Prime Minister rather than genuine change, which is what people hoped for, and actually what you need to put public services and the UK economy back on track.
Thank you, Philippa. Speaking of which, the UK economy is the next item. So there was a recent opinion poll which highlighted the Prime Minister's unpopularity. It also showed that Starmer's government has almost lost its lead on the economy. It's only 1 point ahead on the issue, down from a 10-point lead in July. And perhaps it's no surprise when headlines tell us that the UK debt has hit 100% of GDP, the highest level since 1961. This is in advance of Rachel Reeves' autumn budget. ONS figures, Office for National Statistics figures show monthly borrowing rose more than expected. Labour cited economic inheritance as the cause of, or the excuse for the tax hikes, cuts to welfare and other government budgets. Apparently all of this has led to a corresponding fall in consumer confidence. My question to you, Hugh, I think it is this time, as the Labour government gets ready to announce the budget, will they achieve growth or austerity by sticking to Tory fiscal rules? Looking to you, Hugh.
Yeah, I'll keep this brief, but basically, they're economically, I just don't know what they're trying to achieve. You need to invest in order to grow an economy. They seem to think that the economy will grow magically. We know that from a UK perspective that it's now primarily a service based industrial base. Sort of manufacturing has long gone. So it's in through those services. So how are they going to do that? One of the things, the fact that they're not taxing large corporations enough, that could help. Use that money to invest. There's nothing to stop them borrowing money. I know they're saying there's this black hole, but I think is that Japan operates at something like 250% debt against their their GDP. So Japan doesn't look as though it's on the verge of collapsing anytime soon. So there is room to do it, but I think they're obsessed, and I think Rachel Reeves and both Starmer and Reeves are obsessed with, we've got to show people that we can be as tough as Conservatives, rather than being sort of open-minded, saying, right, actually no, we need to invest in public services. We need to invest in order for the economy to grow. I just can't see it happening, and what they're doing. But again, the proof will be in the pudding when we actually hear what's in the budget. But I just don't think Rachel Reeves, I don't think she gets it.
Okay, thank you, Hugh. Philippa, I don't know if you saw there was a poll earlier this week conducted by Survation for Progress Scotland, and it found that 71% of 71% of people think relations with Europe would be better if Scotland was independent. 65% thought that human rights would be better, 64% thought employment rights would be better, and 58% of people in Scotland thought energy security would be better with independence. And I'm just reminded, we were talking about the budget, Rachel Reeves' budget. Of course, the Scottish Government can't set its budget. It has to wait for Rachel Reeves to announce, to find out how much money they're going to get before they can decide where they want to spend it. But do you think John Swinney was right earlier this week when he was marking the 10th anniversary of the independence campaign, when he said that on the basis of this poll, or he didn't say, but do you think on the basis of this poll that John Swinney was right when he said earlier this week that the referendum had left a positive legacy on Scotland? And was he right when he told campaigners in Edinburgh that it was time to reawaken optimism and hope to secure independence?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, obviously we're kind of a bit in the doldrums after the election in July, but what we see in polls is support for independence holding up. I think one of the problems is that ever since Brexit, the movement and the SNP, we've spent too much of our time looking at process, the how. Can you get another Section 30 order? Can you have a referendum? Do you use a de facto of some kind of an election, a Westminster one, a Holyrood one, the list vote, whatever it is? Whereas actually our issue is that we have half the Scottish population do not yet believe in the potential of their own country. And you mentioned energy, as I was saying earlier, the immense energy wealth that Scotland has, and yet we have a third of our population living in fuel poverty, is outrageous. So to me, just energy in a nutshell is part of the argument for independence. And of course, the damage of Brexit, which they now estimate by 2035 will be running at over 300 billion. So, we don't get to control those decisions, and that's the problem. We're handicapped by them. I mean, Hugh talked about that the Labour government could borrow. They have put themselves in a straitjacket that doesn't make sense. Even Lord Darcy's report on NHS in England and how to get it to recover calls for a massive expansion of digital equipment and digitization. That would require capital investment. You need to invest in infrastructure to save later on. You need to invest to allow an economy to recover. But what they're going to do is turn off the money supply. And the problem is the Scottish government don't have that power. The UK government aren't really even borrowing. They borrow from themselves through the Bank of England. They can easily spend more if it is dealing with infrastructure, physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, or investing in helping businesses grow, tackling the cost of poverty. The Treasury think they're saving money with austerity, but if you're not investing in children in their early years, you'll be picking up the pieces for their whole lifetime. If they don't succeed in school because they're cold and hungry in a damp house, then they may be unemployed and you'll be paying benefits. You'll be dealing with the criminal justice system, addiction, all the things that are directly associated with poverty. And as I said earlier, pensioners ending up in hospital or social care. So we have this constant failure to look at the cost of austerity. And what it also does is simply it fails in that you strangle local economies. As you were saying earlier, people at the lower end of the economic pyramid spend their money. They don't put the money in a tax haven. And that drives local economies. If people in a local town have no money, you end up with a dead high street, and eventually you get a smaller tax return back to the Treasury. George Osborne had promised to austerity would only last until 2015. We're 14 years down the line, and it still hasn't worked. And so we have this, they have tied themselves up. It is absolutely a choice. And as the economist Danny Blanchflower said, he thought they were smarter than that. I'm a surgeon, not an economist, but it's clear to me that this strangling of money into public services, decent benefits or decent pensions actually damages your economy. It doesn't allow your economy to function.
Thank you, Philippa. So, as I mentioned briefly there, Wednesday marked the 10th anniversary of the Scottish independence referendum. For at least 50% of Scots, the desire for independence has not diminished. So, what is the future for the UK and Scotland? Could we see Nigel Farage as Prime Minister? Well, you'll remember that people laughed when some folks suggested that Boris Johnson might be Prime Minister, and people laughed at that. John Curtis has recently said that when you look at the general election, the Reform got almost as many votes as the Scottish Greens in Scotland. So it looks like we could be looking at Reform in both parliaments. Nigel Farage as Prime Minister, will there be a Northern Ireland border poll? I think both Nicola Sturgeon and John Swinney earlier this week said that they thought there would be, and it would directly impact on Scottish independence. And if so, what would happen then in Wales? Would that automatically then become would the union just simply disintegrate as a result? Is it just held together with sellotape? And how would the SNP convince a majority of Scots to support independence? Philippa, sorry, it's quite a lengthy, sort of garbled question. Is there anything that you can rescue from that?
well, I think it is just held together by sellotape, the union, as you say. But as I was saying, we were too much focused on process. What we need to be doing is actually getting out there and giving people a positive vision of what independence could mean for Scotland. And from my point of view, I was down in Biggar on Friday giving a talk on the well-being economy. So instead of having an economy that's treated like a sacred cow, and on the altar of which people are sacrificed and the planet is sacrificed, and then governments are meant to pick up the pieces by mitigating poverty or ill health or homelessness, you can actually look at using the macroeconomic levers to drive an economy that is more sustainable and fairer and less damaging in the first place. So that's to my mind, one of the key visions of an independent Scotland. And you also need to set about, as the Scottish Currency Conference was doing this weekend, talking about some of the key things that put people off in the past. So to me, moving towards independence is you have to get a majority of Scottish people to believe in it. It's as simple as that. And there's no shortcut to that. We talk about the sovereignty of the people of Scotland. Well, don't talk about that and then focus on, oh, is there some shortcut or some way of jumping people into independence? The power would come when we have a majority of people in Scotland who realise this would allow us to make our own decisions, to build a country that we want to live in and that we want to pass on to our children and their children. And that's something that isn't just the responsibility of politicians, whether SNP or Green. It's the responsibility of every single person who believes in independence. We should all be reaching out to the people who are around us. And as for Nigel Farage ending up as Prime Minister, as you say, you hark back to when there was the warning about Boris Johnson being Prime Minister and people laughed. I think it has exactly the same potential. If you look at the data from the election, what you see is Labour ended up with a massive majority because of reform. If reform hadn't stood in the same way as the Brexit Party didn't stand in 2019 and gifted Johnson his majority, then actually there would be a Conservative government now and not a Labour government. And Nigel Farage has set his sights on replacing the Tory party and leading reform to replace it. So that is a potential for the future. And if you look at that poll that you were referring to, what you see in Scotland is Labour support has plummeted, but reform has risen. And so there is certainly a serious likelihood of having reform MSPs in the Scottish Parliament after 2026. And I think that that's something that, we should all be anxious about because they are so much on the far right. But it's still not the level of support we see in England. And that difference between Scotland and England being really attracted into the far right, the riots that we saw, is something ordinary people in Scotland, we should be looking towards the future and thinking, do we really want to be tied onto that sinking ship that is Brexit Britain, isolationist, right-wing, xenophobic? Certainly from my point of view, the answer is categorically not.
Thank you, Philippa. Hugh, what about yourself? What do you think the biggest risk to the Union is? Is it a reunited Ireland, or is it Farage as Prime Minister, or maybe something else?
No, I think it's the Labour Party because they're the ones in power now. So what happens over the next 5 years is going to have an impact. As Philippa said, what worries me, and I tweeted this earlier in the week, is the revision of Labour in Wales and Scotland. Yes, it'll benefit SNP and Plaid Cymru, but it'll benefit in a greater way reform. We've had experience in Wales back in the previous Senedd when we had 7 UKIP assembly members, as they were then, elected. And they were useless. We had Mark Reckless, we had Neil Hamilton. It was just like a load of cats in a sack who basically ended up falling out with each other. And this is what will happen with reform. They cannot attract the caliber of people required to be able to think about how to actually run things. All they want to do is complain about things. They haven't got solutions, and any solutions they have are extreme and unworkable. So I think it's really important over the next, sort of year and a half. And I think public needs to be informed better. They need to be better informed. We saw the riots in Southport. That was based on, again, fear of, immigrants, illegal immigrants, people coming in small boats. This idea that, the Britain is being taken over by some sort of force, and people read this stuff on Facebook, believe it, and it makes them angry. And you can see why people are angry. People's lives in many places in Wales, England, and Scotland aren't great, and they're looking for a reason. Reform are giving them, the reason that, they want the things they want to hear that aren't based in reality. So, it's a real risk, but it's up to, parties like Plaid Cymru, the Greens and the SNP to step into that space and offer a genuine alternative. The other thing, because obviously there was polling out by YouGov last week that was looking at polling in Wales and Scotland about people's attitude towards Holyrood and the Senedd. You got 20% of people in Scotland who want to see Holyrood abolished. In Wales, there's 31%. When you dig down into those numbers, from a Welsh perspective, they're mainly over 65 male Reform voters. So you can see that even though you've got these numbers that look significant, they are from a certain sector of society. So, but I think we need to be putting out something, and I think one of the things that's damaged the Senedd in Wales is the fact that people have had 25 years and their lives aren't better. The NHS isn't being run better. Education isn't better. So it's not the establishment that's at issue. It's it's what is actually delivered, and obviously it's limited in what it can deliver, as is Holyrood. We need to have an honest conversation about what these bodies need and require in order to give change. And I just can't see that Conservatives previously and even Labour now. Labour are looking at doing devolution to Northern England. I can guarantee you that because some of the devolved sort of mayoralties like Manchester have got more powers than Wales. I can guarantee you that when devolution is handed out to Northern England, it'll have more powers than Wales and Scotland currently has.
Thank you, Hugh. Philippa, just really briefly, because I want to let you get back to what's left of the weekend, is there anything you'd like to respond to what Hugh had to say?
Well, I think I do agree with him in a way that Labour are going to contribute to the support for independence, whether in Wales, Scotland, or to the drive for unification in Northern Ireland. Certainly in Scotland, obviously the referendum 10 years ago was under a Conservative government. We saw, the behaviour of Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, etc. And there was always that kind of narrative in the background, but Labour will come in on a white horse and save everybody, and then there'll be no drive for independence. And I think people will actually see quite quickly that there's nothing that we're going to gain from a Labour government at Westminster. As we said, they can borrow, they can spend to invest, whereas both the Welsh and Scottish government have to balance their budgets every single year. If they even had multi-year budgets that they could invest this year to save in 2 years' time, it would be easier to manage. But what we're going to see is, particularly in Scotland, we will see Scotland kept on bread and water to try and shut down SNP policies. And then in 2026, there'll be a promise of bountiful plenty if there's a Labour government in Scotland. And we're going to see that. There's no question that we're going to see that. But in the longer term, if you want to control your future, you have to be in control of your future. And the only way to achieve that is independence.
Thank you, Philippa. Well, I think that is it. We started late, but I think we should finish early because you were here on time and I wasn't. But so thank you once again to Dr. Philippa Whitford and to you, Hugh Marshall, for your time for this weekend. Really appreciate it. And thank you for your patience with me too. So that is it for this week's Full Scottish. But before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but we only receive donations of around £2,500. We urgently need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear our debts as well. We are at crisis point again and really need to increase our donations to be able to pay our bills and survive. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you could afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter and please donate whatever you can afford. So thank you to you at home. Thank you once again to both my guests and goodbye and thank you for watching.